Greetings from the cosmic horror. The stars are right once again, and the great old ones are allowing us to talk about for 30 plus minutes. H.P. Lovecraft, the horror writer who's a genre unto himself. I am your cosmic host, Mark Griffin, executor of the Lovecraft estate on Yawgif, joined in with Richard Wilson, who declines to take showers. Today's guest is Today's guest is Steve Vertlieb, a film historian and writer, and who knew horror author Robert Bloch, who is the topic for today's podcast. Robert Bloch is best known for, well, we'll get to that shortly. Thank you for coming along. So I understand that you became a fan of Robert Bloch because of a certain TV show.
The television show was Thriller, which aired on NBC either 1960 or 61, but it was perhaps the first horror anthology show broadcast over a major network, and Boris Karloff would host each week. They began the series with stories of suspense. I think they were trying to find their direction, and they were emulating the Alfred Hitchcock hour. And a number of critics complained about that and said, with a host like Boris Karloff, why are you trying to be Alfred Hitchcock? So about a third way into the first season, they began experimenting with pure horror. And many, if not most, of the classic episodes of that first season of Thriller were written by Robert Bloch. So being a horror fan, I started searching for his work in bookstores, and I found a number of his novels and collections of short stories in paperback, and I began buying them and reading them, and they scared the crap out of me, which got a little messy, but I cleaned it up. So after becoming transfixed by the works of Bob Bloch, I tried to find him, see how I might contact him. It's a long time ago, but I think I contacted him through his publisher, and we began corresponding. This would have been somewhere around 1969, and we became fast friends through correspondence. I have lots and lots of handwritten letters from Bob. Finally, I told him that I was coming out to Los Angeles for the first time in 1974 during that summer, and we arranged to meet. And that was quite an auspicious day, being a lifelong movie fan. I was thrilled beyond words. My brother called me a hick. Every time I saw a movie poster, I'd ask him to stop the car. And we saw a poster of Frank Sinatra performing with John Denver in Las Vegas. And I asked him in the middle of a highway to stop the car. I jumped out of the car and took photographs of the poster because I adore Sinatra. In any event, Bob volunteered to be our guide for the day. My brother was not driving at that point. He'd only been in LA for a short time, going to college there. So Bob Bloch picked us up, served as our tour guide for an entire day from morning until night. We drove around as Bob showed us the sights of Los Angeles. We went to Fari Ackerman's house. I'm assuming you know who that is. Mm-hmm. The editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland back then. And met Fari for the first, no, actually I met Fari in 65 in New York, but I hadn't seen him since that time. So Bob took us over to Fari's Acker Mansion, which I'd never seen. And after that, we went over to Paramount Studios. Now, at the time, George Pal of The Time Machine and War of the Worlds was going to be involved with producing and directing a miniseries for CBS based upon In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. And Bob was going to do the teleplay for that. So we went over to George Pal's office at Paramount, and I met George Pal for the first time, which is quite exciting. Sadly, CBS lost interest in the project and they dropped it. So the teleseries was never filmed. Um, After that, Bob took us on a tour of the studio, and I can remember walking down the Western Street and doing my horrible impression of John Wayne with his walk and his voice. And my brother shook his head, looked at Bob, and said, "My brother, the hick." Following that, we went back to Bob's house in the Hollywood Hills. And I have a very clear remembrance of walking into his office. I had been writing for a variety of fanzines at that point. And one of them was a British fanzine called L'Incroyable Cinema. Another was an American publication called Cinemacabre, published by George Stover, who appeared in many of the John Waters films. And laying on Bob's desk was a copy of Cinemacabre, featured very prominently on his desk. I'm guessing, being a gentleman, that Bob did that on purpose because I was coming over to the house for dinner. But I was starstruck and happy to see a magazine with my writings sitting on his desk. We had dinner. My brother Erwin and I, along with Bob and his wife, Ellie. And Ellie was delightful. Bob was very, very funny. I'm sure you know he was, aside from writing horror stories, he was a man of extreme wit and was quite a punster. And he told jokes all night. We all groaned. At one point, I asked Ellie, which of Bob's stories is your favorite? And she shocked me when she said, "I've never read any of Bob's work." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "The Bob I know is a sweet, gentle soul. I prefer to see that side of him only." So I was surprised, but we had a lovely evening. And then Bob was kind enough to drive us back to my brother's apartment in downtown LA. But Bob was just such a sweet and gentle man, and we had a lovely relationship. I regarded him as a dear friend for about 25 years until his passing. I remember one of the last times I saw Bob was at Fari Ackerman's 1993 Famous Monsters convention in Crystal City, Virginia. And Bob was already growing ill. He was using a cane at that point, and he seemed to be under the weather, I recall. And the convention staff were kind of running around and I hate to say it, but ignoring this great man. And he was going to do his on-stage presentation, or now we're with Robert Bloch, but he was his throat was dry, and he needed a glass of water. So I ran and got him a cup of water and gave it to him. And the day he, I won't say the day he died. Well, actually, it was the day he died. I had some friends who were heavily into science fiction fandom, Bruce and Flo Newrock in New Jersey, and they came over to my apartment. And knowing my relationship with Bob, asked if I knew that he was dying of cancer. I hadn't been in touch with him for a few weeks, and I was shocked. He kept it quiet. I was told that he was terrified of dying, as am I, and I guess we all are. But I telephoned his home and wanted to speak with Ellie and talk to the housekeeper. And I went into my bedroom and closed the door and dialed the number. And I said, I'm Steve Vertlieb. I'm a friend of Robert's. I just wanted to say hi and maybe speak with Ellie. I knew he wasn't doing well. I waited about 2 minutes and Ellie came onto the phone and started talking about Bob passing away that morning. And I was stunned. It took me totally by surprise. I filled up with tears and I said, "Ellie, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I love Bob, and she said, I know he loved you too. And I was brokenhearted. But as I say, Bob and I loved each other. We were dear friends for 25 years. He was also always giving me writing tips. I had sent him I had written reams of poetry, and a lot of it dealing with horror and the supernatural and science fiction. And he seemed to appreciate them, but he said, you should turn them into a short story or a novella, which I never did, but he took a great interest in my work. He loved my articles about film history. I remember that Christopher Lee had moved in, I believe it was next door. And I wanted to contact Chris and wrote him a letter. I sent the letter to Bob, and he was kind enough to give the letter to Chris Lee. And then I had a letter back from Lee with some autographed pictures, thanking me for my interest in his work. Bob and I shared a number of interests in film history. He was a great admirer of Buster Keaton, and he wrote me that Buster Keaton was the happiest soul he had ever known. Forgive me. We talked a bit about the sale of Psycho. You may know this, but Bob told me that the novel Psycho was purchased in a blind bid. He didn't know that it was Alfred Hitchcock, and of course, Hitchcock did that to get the novel for a song. I'm not sure what the song was, but when Bob found out that the novel had been sold to Hitchcock, he wished that he had gotten more money for it. But he always maintained, and he told me that Hitchcock, despite the protest of Joe Stefano, who did the screenplay, Hitchcock always said publicly that 90% of Hitchcock was 90% rather of Psycho was Robert Bloch. But I can't emphasize this enough, that despite his writings and the horrific nature of his writings, Bob was just a dear, sweet, gentle soul with a wonderful sense of humor. We both adored film music. He loved the music of Bernard Herrmann. And I know Dorothy Herrmann, Herrmann's daughter. I even presented a posthumous Life Achievement Award to Bernard Herrmann at another convention in Virginia, and Dorothy showed up to accept the award. And I was doing a panel discussion on Hitchcock, oddly enough. This was at another convention in Crystal City, and I was sat on a 1-hour panel on the works of Alfred Hitchcock, and I sat right next to Pat, talking about his films. And I showed her a lovely photograph Hitchcock had sent me of him with his 2 dogs. And he autographed it to my brother and I showed it to her and said, here's your dad with my brother and myself. And she got a big kick out of that. Dorothy Herrmann came over when we finished the discussion and introduced herself to me. And I said, Pat, this is Dorothy Herrmann. Dorothy, this is Pat Hitchcock. And I almost ducked because of the famous feud between their 2 fathers, but they got along famously and laughed a lot about their relationship and the relationship between Hitchcock and Herrmann. They'd had a major falling out when Torn Curtain was being filmed. You may know this or not, but Herrmann, of course, had written all of Hitchcock's 1950s films and early 60s films, North by Northwest, Psycho, Vertigo, Marnie, Trouble with Harry. When Hitchcock was filming Psycho and doing the shower sequence, he gave instructions to Bernard Herrmann that he wanted that scene done without any background scoring, no music at all. And Hitchcock was going on vacation. Herrmann said to him, Hitch, I think you're wrong. I'd like to write music for the scene. You do whatever you want, but listen to the that scene with my music when you get back from vacation. And of course, the famed shower scene with the screaming violins of the knife being plunged into Janet Leigh, Marion Crane. And when Hitchcock heard the music, he said, speaking of himself, improper suggestion, my boy. And so he used the music, and of course, it went on to become one of the most famous scenes and musical sequences in film history. Um, what else? What would you like to ask me?
Let's go back to Thriller. What was it about Robert Bloch that attracted you, that you want to know when to collect all of his stories?
His stories scared the hell out of me, especially The Hungry Glass. And I read The Hungry House after seeing The Hungry Glass. William Shatner, of course, was the lead in that. They buy an old secluded house for a song. Uh, they wondered why it was so cheap. The reason is the house was haunted. At least that was the legend of the house. Shatner had a nervous breakdown and starts seeing ghostly images and apparitions. One particular scene I remember, he's shaving in the bathroom and he closes the bathroom cabinet door with a mirror. And as he does that, he sees a dark image behind him and cuts his face. It's very scary. Um, the whole story I never forgot it. He wrote others, of course, The Cheaters being one of the most prominent ones. But I was just so taken with his style of writing and how they were so horrifying. It reminded me a lot of H.P. Lovecraft, who is my favorite writer. Bob is a close second. So I started reading Bob and reading Lovecraft, and they became interconnected in my mind. And of course, Bob was, as a young man, an original member of the Lovecraft Circle, got much of his inspiration from Howard Phillips. And we had discussions about that. Um, but I was just, Thriller was a great series. Boris Karloff, of course, uh, being one of the great horror stars of all time, lent authenticity to the stories. The fact that it was in black and white, I think, also aided immeasurably to the atmosphere and overall horror of the stories on that show. But it was a great series, perhaps the greatest horror series ever. There was a DVD set released not too many years ago, and I love watching those shows again. I was in touch with Boris himself. A friend of mine gave me his address in London, and I sent him a bunch of photographs, and Karloff was very kind enough to send me them autographed. I still have those. People keep asking if I'll sell them. Maybe someday, but for now the answer is no. But I also know Sarah Karloff, and I wrote an article about Karloff's career, which Sarah put on her website for her father. But I've been involved in writing myself for about 55 years, and in books and magazines, and I've done a number of podcasts. I've lectured at universities. Uh, did a show at the Philadelphia Art Museum with local host Gene London about the making of King Kong. Kong is my favorite film. I've written reams about that. And I knew Marion C. Cooper, who produced it, created it, and directed it. And I knew Fay Wray and spent several afternoons at Fay's home in Century City, California, back in the 70s. And she was quite lovely.
Is it
But
just the original King Kong that you like? Did you like any of the other variations?
I hated the 1976 Dino De Laurentiis film. he arrogantly bragged that it would far surpass the primitive special effects of the original. Of course, he had a man in a suit, so how that surpassed the original stop motion, I have no idea. But it was dreadful. It was a dreadful script, dreadful acting and direction, being somewhat prophetic. I remember saying at the time that I saw it that Jessica Lange would never go anywhere. Um, I was wrong about that, quite obviously. But it was an awful script. I wrote an article for a magazine which I called "'Twas Dino Killed the Beast." And I remember writing that the screenplay was simple-minded. But as far as the Peter Jackson film, I went with high expectations because the original film is my favorite movie of all time. I've probably seen it about 300 times, even watched it last night on TCM. Um, but when I first went to see it, I was really disappointed. I thought the first half hour was garbage. Peter Jackson said that his favorite film of all time is King Kong. Why he chose Jack Black, of all people, to play Carl Denham, I have no idea, because Robert Armstrong was just so wonderful and vital and energetic in the original film. Jack Black is a comedian, he's a comic actor. He's fine in some of his uh, comic films, but as Carl Denham, he was just totally wrong. He was hamming it up beyond words. And I'd like to take the first couple of reels of that film and throw them in the trash. But once they get to Skull Island, it starts getting better. And the last half hour of that film, from the sequence in the park where Kong is on the ice, from the climb up the Empire State Building, I think is as good as anything in the original film. But I was dreadfully disappointed and wrote a terrible review of the film, mainly concentrating on Jack Black and how silly and outlandish that was. My brother saw it, fell in love with it, and urged me to see it again. I waited a week and went back to the theater, saw it again. I liked it a little bit more, went back a few days later, saw it again. I must have seen it a half dozen times in inside of a month. I still hate the first half hour of the film, but I think much of the film from the island sequences on are magical, and that, again, the climb up the Empire State Building is just heartbreaking and superbly enacted. Um, but the original film will always be my favorite.
So, what was I guess going back to Robert Bloch, what was the first Robert Bloch story you remember reading?
The Hungry House.
The Hungry House.
Yeah, because I had seen The Hungry Glass and wanted to read his original version, and it scared the hell out of me. And I also read The Cheaters, and I started buying books like Nightmares, More Nightmares, Even More Nightmares, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. I've got a huge shelf of Robert Bloch books on my shelf in my bedroom.
So, what is it about Robert Bloch you love so much? Is it just his use of like suspense in his stories?
I'm a horror nut. I have been since I was a kid. I love being scared. Used to go to see all the 1950s science fiction, horror, monster movies that came out at the time, like them and Ray Harryhausen's 20 Million Miles to Earth. Don't know if you're interested, but I was a dear friend of Ray Harryhausen's for close to 50 years. And I knew Ray Bradbury very well for close to 40 years. So these gentlemen were all in that same circle. I've always said that the greatest joy of my life is that I have not only met, but in many cases become dear friends with most of my lifelong childhood heroes, including Bloch, Bradbury, Harryhausen. They all became dear friends. But being into horror, I can remember as a kid reading H.P. Lovecraft, and I was just terrified. I couldn't sleep after reading those stories. I can remember when I still lived with my mom and dad, and my brother lived there as well. My mom and dad went somewhere. They weren't in the house, they went on vacation. And my brother and I were left alone at the house. And I asked Erwin if he wanted to read The Shadow Out of Time, which is my favorite Lovecraft story. And I can remember I was in my room watching TV, and my brother Erwin was down in the living room sitting on a couch reading Lovecraft's The Shadow Out of Time. What both of us forgot was that the lamp next to the chair where he was sitting had a timer on it. And at 12 midnight, the lamp would automatically click off. And midway through The Shadow Out of Time, the light plunged him into darkness, and I heard him scream and run up the stairs, and I was laughing hysterically. But I started with Lovecraft, got into Bloch. I just thought the stories were just so utterly terrifying and original that they made an indelible impression upon me.
So did you know originally that that Bloch was like almost like an underling of Lovecraft? You
I
know
did.
that
I did. The more I read his stories, the more I wanted to research him and look into him and just find out who it was that Robert Bloch really was. Then when we connected, and he actually became our tour guide for that entire first day that I was ever in Los Angeles, I felt so gifted. It was just amazing. And the fact that our friendship grew over the years and he became, as far as literature and writing, he really became a mentor to me. He took a great interest in my articles and everything that I did. And we had just so many interests and friends in common. But I grew to love the man, not only as one of my favorite writers, but as a human being. Um, I was impressed he was a man possessed of so many interests, and his interest in the arts and his culture. I had tremendous admiration for Bob, not only as a writer, but as a human being.
I've always heard the saying, never meet your heroes, but apparently that's not true for you.
It has never been true for
The
me.
exception. Yeah.
No, no exceptions. I met Buster Crabbe, who was one of my first childhood heroes, and he became a buddy. I met him a number of times, and the last time Buster was in Philadelphia was in 1979. I had been away visiting some friends in Baltimore. I was still living at home. I came home and asked my dad, did anybody call for me? He said, yeah, Buster Crabbe telephoned for you. I said, no, really, did anybody call? He said, no, really, Buster Crabbe called you. It took him about a half an hour to convince me that Buster had really telephoned. Buster was at a convention somewhere in Center City, Philadelphia, and he was asking fans there if they knew who Steve Vertlieb was. No one did, no surprise. He got out a telephone book and found a Charles Vertlieb, called him, and he said, do you know a Steve Vertlieb? And he said, yeah, it's my son. So he identified himself as Buster Crabbe. He said, I'm in town for a convention. Ask Steve to call me Monday morning. I'd like to have dinner with him. So I called him. We got together the next night. He took me out to a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. And I remember he was like a Jewish mother. He was concerned I wasn't eating enough. So he was emptying food from his plate into my plate and saying, here, eat, eat. Buster had invited me to stop by his home in Scottsdale, Arizona, and stay with him for a few days midway through my trip to LA. I wish I had taken him up on that. I never did. But he was quite a guy, and um, he became a friend. Ray Harryhausen was a wonderful soul. Harryhausen would write me, telephone me. Bradbury, when I came to LA, I would notify his daughter, uh, Z for zebra, EE. That was what he called her. I would tell Z that I was coming out west, and Z would tell Ray that I was coming, and she said he got all excited. And I remember, I know it's about Bob Bloch, but I remember the last time I saw Bradbury, he'd had several strokes. He was not in good condition. He had trouble speaking. But when we were getting up to leave, he told me that Dandelion wine was acquired for filming. I don't think it ever happened, but he'd been told that day that someone had purchased the rights to the novel. And he was all excited about that. When we were leaving, I said, Ray, you are loved by millions of fans all over the world. And I saw a tear coming out of his eye, dripping down his face. And I hugged him and I kissed him. And when Erwin and I left his house, something made me stop and turn around and look at the front door. And I said to Erwin, I have a feeling this is the last time we're ever going to see Ray. And he did pass away. But I've had so many heroes who turned out to be wonderful people. And I don't know, maybe they saw something in me. In all humility, I can't imagine what. But I knew Miklos Rozsa, who was my favorite composer, won the Oscar for Ben-Hur, won the Oscar 3 times, actually. But he became a dear friend. I know his daughter, Juliet. I've been very fortunate. I've been blessed. If when I look back on my life at age 78 and a half years, I look at all the photographs around my apartment, the mementos, the letters. That's the greatest joy of my life. If I ever get down, whenever I get depressed, I look at those pictures and think these people were friends of mine. And how incredible is that?
So what was it about wanting to reach out to these people, to write to them? I guess, was it just like you wanted to understand the creative process, or you just thought they're really cool people?
I just wanted to touch them. They meant so much to me. Jerry Goldsmith, one of the great film composers. I was writing an article. I was the film music critic for Cinemacabre magazine, and I was doing an article about Jerry Goldsmith and his scores. So I did some homework, reached out to the West Coast and found his publicist. I said, I'm doing an article about Jerry. I need some stills with which to illustrate it. Can you send them to me? And he said, well, I don't have any, but you might talk to Jerry. And I thought, I'll bite. How do I reach out to Jerry? Now, this was 1980. Try contacting any of these people now. It's impossible. But he gave me a phone number. I telephoned in the evening. A woman answered with a Spanish accent and said, Mr. and Mrs. Goldsmith are out to dinner. Can I take a message? So I thought, this does not sound like a publicist. It sounds like a housekeeper. So I left my name and phone number. I said, I'm writing an article. And the next morning, I had received a telephone call. And a gentleman said, am I speaking with Steve Vertlieb? I said, yes. He said, Steve, this is Jerry Goldsmith returning your call. So I had a mild heart attack, and he was very kind. And he said, I just did a photo shoot. It'll take about a few weeks till I get the stills back. Can you wait? I said, I'll wait. So I waited. He sent me the photographs. I used them in the article. And he wrote me back a lovely letter, which I still have, thanking me for the article and for understanding his work as a composer and appreciating the art of film music. And I was stunned. I've had many such experiences where I just, being an artist myself, if I can flatter myself that way after 55 years of published articles, and I feel an affinity with these people. And if someone's work impresses me, either as a director or an actor or a writer or a composer, I've always done what I can to find out who represents them and make personal contact. Mark McKenzie is a composer out in Los Angeles. He's written some wonderful scores, particularly for a film called Max and Me about the Holocaust. And I was friendly with a classical guitarist named Greg Nestor out in LA. And he said, I have a friend named Mark McKenzie who you should meet. He loves your work. He read your articles about Hitchcock and Orson Welles and would love to meet you. So I connected, and Mark is a wonderful guy, another sweet, gentle soul. And every year when I go out to LA, I get together with Mark and Greg Nestor and Pat Russ, who was an orchestrator, who's done a lot of Hollywood films. I've just had incredible luck in that regard.
So is what you've been doing almost like something that can be done today, with internet and
No,
everything? And
no, not at all. Not at all. I was born in 1945. I grew up with the advent of television when everything was new. Back when I started contacting these people in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was if you did your due diligence and your homework, you could reach them. Now, whether or not they responded is another matter. But I guess these folks saw something in me. Miklos Rozsa, three-time Oscar winner, one of the great Hollywood composers. I was with him. We had corresponded for years. I was with him at a film conference in Bloomington, Indiana. I was working in television at a Philadelphia TV station. I had a phone call from Harry Gettold, who was a professor of film and literature at the main campus of Indiana University in Bloomington. Harry co-wrote with Ron Gottesman The Girl in the Hairy Paw, which is the first published book about the making of King Kong. I wrote the lead chapter for that book. Harry called me at the TV station and said, we're having a film conference. Caroline and I would like you to come stay with us this weekend. I said, I don't know, I can't get away. I'm up to my eyebrows in work. I said, who's going to be there? He said, Molly Haskell, the esteemed New Yorker film critic. I said, I'd like to meet Molly, but I just can't get out of town. I said, who else is going to be there? He said, George Pal is coming. I said, wow, I'd love to meet George Pal again. I met him with Bob Bloch at Paramount 5 years earlier. I still can't get away. Is anyone else coming? He said, yeah, Miklos Rozsa is going to be here. I said, let me call the airport and call you right back. So I spent 11 hours glued to the side of Miklos Rozsa talking about music and his career. When I was leaving Indiana, Miklos Rozsa, with his hat and his warm winter coat, walked up to me and took my hands in his. And he looked at me with his steely eyes and said in his thick Hungarian accent, I feel that you are a very sincere man. And I damn near cried. After that, George Pal and I shared a limousine going back to Indianapolis Airport. Here I am with the producer, director of Time Machine and War of the Worlds and Destination Moon, When Worlds Collide. It's just me and George Pal together for a solid hour in a limousine, talking I've just had this kind of incredible luck meeting my heroes and having them respond to me. They see something in my work, I guess, in all humility. Um, I always, I've always been down on myself. Like many of us, have self-doubts, and I always have to pinch myself that these people not only were friends but respected what I did. Veronica Carlson is another one. Veronica Carlson was a gorgeous British actress with Hammer Films, acted with Christopher Lee in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave and with Peter Cushing in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. We hit it off instantly. I gave her a piece of poetry I had written called Orphan of the Night, and she read it, came back to the convention, and she had long nails and dug her fingernails into my arm. And I said, why are you doing that? What are you doing that for? She said, I read your poem and I cried. Peter Cushing. I love Peter Cushing. I got his address in England. We corresponded for years. He finally came to a convention in New York. I believe it was one of Fari Ackerman's famous monsters conventions. But Peter came out of the elevator. I walked up to him and I said, Mr. Cushing, we corresponded. He said, what's your name? Now, I love my brother. He's been my best friend my whole life. So I wanted any response to include him. So any of the letters that I wrote to these people, I signed it Stephen Irwin Vertlieb. So Peter came out of the elevator. I said, Mr. Cushing, we used to correspond. He said, what's your name? I said, Steve Vertlieb. Now, he had appeared in A Chump at Oxford in 1939 with Laurel and Hardy. So he looked at me and he said, oh, yes, you used to write to me with your brother, just like Laurel and Hardy. It was very charming and delightful. When his wife passed away, Helen, he wrote me the saddest, most poignant, heartbreaking letters about how he's struggling since his beloved Helen passed away. But I regarded Peter as a friend. I had never met Chris Lee. He was appearing at a convention. I had a friend who knew him, and I said, I'm not asking you for his address, but I would like to write him. I had written him through Bob Bloch years earlier. I'd like to write him again. And I asked him, would you send the letter to Chris? I included some photographs of myself with Veronica Carlson and Caroline Monroe. Chris Lee, I was told, had a photographic memory. Now, bear in mind, I'd never met him. I'm in line at a convention to have him sign my book. I gave him the book. He looks up to me and he says, I know you. And I felt really weird. I thought, how do I tell Chris Lee he doesn't really know me? As Mr. Lee, with respect, we've never met. And he said, you sent me those photographs with you and those two lovely, lovely young ladies, Caroline and Veronica. I thought, my God, he remembers me from the pictures. That's the kind of luck I've had. If I've accomplished anything in my life, I have somehow connected on a personal level with most of the people I've grown up loving and admiring, the people I've written about. So don't ask me how, I have no idea. But getting back to your original question, could that happen today? Absolutely not. They're protected. You've got to go through any number of channels. Another hero, in fact, my last living lifelong hero was John Williams, the composer of all the Star Wars films, E.T., the Indiana Jones films, Superman, Close Encounters. I tried for years to get a hold of John Williams and connect with him. I've loved him since 1959 when he wrote the TV theme for the CBS series, detective series Checkmate. And then the next year after that, Fred Astaire's Alcoa premiere. And then, of course, Jaws and Star Wars and on and on. I did everything I could, used up every contact I had to meet him. It was a dead end at every turn. Um, I wrote to his publicist. I finally got that, found the name and address of his publicist. I had just had major open heart surgery. I almost died. This was in 2010. I wrote him a letter and saying, look, I've loved this man for all of my life. I just want to meet him only for a minute. I don't want anything from him, but I'd love to meet him. I just had open heart surgery. I'm coming to California. Is there any chance? And he wrote me back and said, do you know how many millions of people would love to meet John Williams? Sorry, pal, it ain't going to happen. I knew Juliet Roja, the daughter of Miklos Roja. John Williams had performed her father's music in concert. Juliet said, I'm going to the bowl for the John Williams concert. I said, are you going backstage? She said, probably. I said, is there any chance I can come back with you? She said, of course. So I got backstage. I'm at the end of a long line. My friend Les Zador, who was the son of another famous composer, Eugene Zador, brought his camera. I'm with Les and Juliet. I started crying. I saw John at the end of the line. I said, oh my God, there he is. So we walked up and Juliet introduced me. I said, I'd like you to meet Steve Vertlieb. He hugged me. Flashbulbs were going on everywhere, from Les, from my brother, from Juliet. And John started cracking up. He said, look at all these flashbulbs going off. I met John 5 times. That was one of the greatest experiences of my life. Sinatra. I mean, Sinatra is my idol. I saw him 14 times in concert. I won a contest and got backstage to his dressing room to meet me. And he put his arm around me, and I've got a picture of me and Sinatra. I've got letters from Frank, an autographed record from Frank, autographed pictures. Don't ask me how, but God has smiled on me. And one of those smiles was for Robert Bloch, who, again, I cherish and remember as a dear personal friend.
Do you feel that when you wrote to Robert Bloch that he was thinking of when he wrote to Lovecraft?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, he even said that to me on one occasion, that everyone is a fan of someone. As high as you reach the ladder of success, there's still someone that you look up to. Even Sinatra had his idols, Bing Crosby. Robert Bloch idolized Lovecraft. The last time I met Bloch at the convention in '93 in Virginia, I was chatting with him, and Richard Matheson walked up and said to me, Bloch was one of his heroes and was a huge influence on his work. Matheson is one of my favorite writers. So, photo op, me and 2 of my favorite writers, Bob Bloch and Dick Matheson.
It seems that Robert Bloch influenced a lot of people because
He
it's like
did.
Stephen King talks highly of him.
Absolutely. Stephen King regards Bloch as one of the great writers of weird fiction and regards him as a hero.
And I believe that Ramsey Campbell, his first introduction to Lovecraftian horror was through a Robert Bloch story.
Yeah, and I know Ramsey. Actually, Ramsey and I started out pretty much with the same fanzine, L'Incroyable Cinema, which was edited by Harry Nadler in Manchester, England, beginning in 1968 and '69. I started corresponding with Harry, and Harry asked me if I would write for the magazine. I'd never written for a magazine before. So I remember a review of 2001, and Ramsey was writing for L'Incroyable Cinema at the same time I was. And speaking of 2001, on going from one thought to another, I was in New York at a convention when 2001 premiered, and the guest at the convention was Arthur C. Clarke. So I remember peeing in the bathroom standing next to Arthur C. Clarke, and I thought, this is an awkward moment. Do I talk to him or not? I decided, nah, it's not the right moment. But my brother and I and my friend Alan Asherman, who you may know from Star Trek books, Alan Asherman was one of my closest friends. Alan introduced me to Buster Crabbe. Al and I and my brother went to see 2001, and we came back to the hotel. And I was walking up a long staircase at the hotel as Arthur C. Clarke was coming down that staircase. And I said, Mr. Clarke, we just saw 2001, and I thought it was a masterpiece. And he looked at me and said, you're the first one to ever tell me that. The critics are killing it. So after a couple of months went by, as we all know, they ate their words and it became a classic. 1 year later, same convention, Arthur Clarke is there again, surrounded by kids. And I said, Mr. Clarke, I don't know if you remember me, but a year ago today, I said to you that 2001 was a masterpiece. You told me I was the first person to ever say that to you. And one of the little snot-nosed brats around him looked at me and said, oh, yeah, sure. Everybody says that now. But it's true. I did. And I have letters from Clarke to prove it.
So, is there anybody that you wish you had met but never got a chance to?
Yes, two people. Judy Garland was one. After Sinatra, Judy is my favorite singer. A Star is Born is one of my all-time favorite films. I would have even given anything to have an opportunity to meet Judy Garland. The other was Bill Boyd, along with Buster Crabbe and Ed Kemmer of the Space Patrol series. Hoppy was my first hero. I was born too late, but I would have given a year of my life to have met Hoppy. I don't know if you're familiar with Space Patrol. You're probably a good deal younger than I am, but one of the very earliest TV space shows on network television was Space Patrol, starring Ed Kemmer as Commander Buzz Corey. Ed also played in The Spider, which is a low budget monster movie. You might remember Ed from Nightmare at 20,000 Feet on the Twilight Zone with William Shatner. Ed Kemmer played the captain who came back to try and calm him down. But I knew Ed largely as Commander Corey on Space Patrol. I got to know Ed later in his life and in mine, and we became good friends for several years. He was a big Sinatra fan, and I made audio tapes for him of records by Sinatra. He lived in New York. I'd send them to him. But beyond that, maybe Steven Spielberg. It's unlikely I'll ever have that opportunity. But as the main people who come to mind are Judy Garland and Hopalong Cassidy, Bill Boyd.
Is there anybody you did meet? Did you regretted meeting them, or has it all been good?
Yes, there was one gentleman. I think his name was, maybe I shouldn't say his name. I think his name was Tony Todd. He played Candyman in the first couple of Candyman films. I was at a convention here in Philadelphia, and I'm old school. As I said, I'm 78 and a half years old. I generally wear a jacket. I like to be professional. I walked up to Tony Todd and said I liked him in the Candyman films. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you a narc?" And I said, "No, I'm just a fan. What do you mean a narc?" And he was really snotty. You know, I can't help being old world. I was raised by my parents to be a gentleman. I don't think I would wear a jacket now, but back then I did. And he looked at me and he was very snide and said, "You're a narc, right? I know you're a narc." And I said, "No, I'm not a narc." Oh, there was one other thing I will mention, and this could get me into trouble. John Landis, the director of Animal House and An American Werewolf in London, numerous films. I really like John's movies, and I heard he was a good guy. Um, when I was married, my then wife, Maria, said, "You write all this poetry about horror. Have you ever considered writing an article about your idol, Frank Sinatra?" And I said, "No, I never thought of that." So I gave it a shot. I wrote it. I heard from Sinatra. I have a beautiful autograph picture in my living room written in gold ink from Frank thanking me for my work. I was very friendly with his wife, Barbara. Barbara liked my poetry. Long story short, I'm at a convention. This was after John's film Innocent Blood had come out. Another dear friend of mine was John Agar. John and I were good buddies for 20 years. We talked on the phone. I loved him. He loved me. I visited him at a nursing home shortly before he passed away. He always called me Stever. Anyway, I'm at a convention. John Landis is there. John Agar is there. I had the poem, my Sinatra poem, with me. If you've ever seen Innocent Blood, it's about vampires and the mob. And the soundtrack is filled with Sinatra. So I thought maybe he's a fan of Frank. So I handed him my poem about Frank Sinatra. He looked at it, looked at me, sneered. He said, "Oh, a poem about Frank Sinatra?" I mean, I felt so humiliated. I skulked away. Flash forward to later the same evening, I'm in the writer's room with John Agar and we're chatting. John Landis walks in to talk to John Agar. Um, Agar throws his arms around me, smiles, and says, "Oh, do you know my good friend Steve Vertlieb?" And John Landis, I swear, looked at me and said, "Hey, Steve." And I've got a picture taken about 5 seconds after that of me and Agar and Landis. And I thought, you hypocritical son of a bitch. I still respect his work as an artist, but he didn't treat me well. And I never forgot that. And I thought, what a hypocrite.
He never said anything about that poem or anything, did he?
No, it didn't come into the conversation ever again. Someone was going to make a documentary about my life. It's called Steve Vertlieb, the man who saved the movies, saved in quotation marks, meaning saved the memories of the films and the actors and the composers and directors. We shot about 85% of it. It never got made. The director ran out of money. But Veronica Carlson is in the film. I asked her, "Would you consent to be interviewed for my documentary?" He said, "Steve, you don't even have to ask." And so she did an interview. That clip is still out there when she talks about me. And she says, "Oh, Steve Vertlieb, he's a blessed, dear, sweet soul. Steve knew everybody." Um, it was, again, one of my memories and the things that keep me going. And when I get down, I think of all the wonderful people I've met and befriended. Veronica was the doll. I was heartbroken when she passed away a couple of years ago, but she's in the documentary that may or may not ever get finished. I don't know if you're aware of the Rondo Awards.
Mhm.
I won a Rondo Life Achievement Hall of Fame Award in June 2016. Again, one of the greatest nights of my life. That's been won by Bradbury, Cushing, Chris Lee, Harryhausen, and David Colton, who runs the Rondos and was formerly the editor in chief of USA Today, David chose me to get a Life Achievement Award. I flew to Louisville, Kentucky with my brother and my girlfriend and accepted the award. I have it hanging on my living room wall, and that's certainly a career highlight. So to quote, I may have lost a career and gone through bankruptcy and gotten a divorce and had two major open heart surgeries, two serious seizures, two mini strokes. But to quote Jimmy Stewart, I've really had a wonderful life.
It sounds like you've been through a lot.
Yeah, indeed.
I have. I have. I'm having surgery next week, next Wednesday, to remove a hernia from my chest. I fell taking my girlfriend home from dinner the night before Easter, and I tripped over a rod sticking out of her neighbor's grill, fell down hard on my left side, nearly broke my hand. It was a claw for 2 weeks, couldn't open it, messed up my shoulder and my elbow, so I need hand surgery after I come back from LA. Going to LA for 3 weeks, July the 10th, and we'll stay with my brother, be with a lot of old friends from 50, 55 years duration. Always have a great time. That keeps me sane for the next 12 months. So I'm looking forward to that.
So you still stay active and everything, I guess.
Oh, yeah, I do. I'm still writing. I was one of the original writers for the Monster Times. Don't know if you're familiar with that, but the Monster Times was the one and only biweekly tabloid ever published. It was published in New York, started in January of 1972. I wrote the cover story for the first issue with a cover of King Kong by Bernie Wrightson. I wrote an article about the making and production of King Kong, wrote articles about them and Horror of Dracula. I interviewed Bill Shatner in 1969. That one was for L'Incroyable Cinema in England, the publication that Ramsey Campbell was also writing for. I heard that Bill Shatner, while Star Trek was still in the air on NBC and rerun in 1969, Bill Shatner was living out of his truck with his two Doberman pinschers. His wife was divorcing him, and after, he even said this recently on, I think, Bill Maher, that after being Captain Kirk and all that fame for 3 years on NBC, suddenly he was a nobody, and he was doing summer stock. So he was appearing at the Playhouse in the Park with Jill Hayworth from Exodus, doing a production of There's a Girl in My Soup. I called the Playhouse in the Park management and said, I'm a writer. I'd like to interview Shatner about Star Trek. So they told me to come and do that. So I went with Alan Ashman and my brother. I sat with Bill Shatner in his dressing room for a solid hour, interviewing him for L'Incroyable. We had a great time. After that, he said, would you boys like to see the show? So he gave us tickets to the show. We watched the production. And I remember as he was leaving the stage, he turned around and looked at us and waved. A couple of years later, the Monster Times wanted to do a reprint of that. I was a little uptight about that because when the magazine published my article about Shatner and the interview, it was by Steve Vertlieb with Alan Ashman and Irwin Vertlieb. By the time it got to the Monster Times, Alan Ashman had already published his book about Star Trek, The Compendium, and the credit read by Alan Ashman with the Vertlieb brothers. And I asked Alan, why did you do that? And he said, well, it was nothing personal. I just people know me more than you. You're basically unknown as a writer. And I have this Star Trek book, and everybody knows me from Star Trek fandom. I was deeply offended by that, but I bought his explanation. However, Alan has sadly passed away about a year ago, and I did love him. He was a dear friend, but if asked, I will come right out and say it was my article, my interview. And if you look back at that magazine, you'll see that I did the interview. But again, one of my heroes, Captain Kirk. I'm told that if you go to a Star Trek convention now, it's almost impossible to get to talk to Shatner. And if you want an autograph, he'll charge, I think, $50 to $100 to sign his name. And don't ask him to sign it Captain Kirk or Jim Kirk. I risked being assaulted. As we were leaving the interview, I said, "Would you mind signing a couple of these stills, Captain Kirk?" And he did it. So,
How
as I
times have
say,
changed.
yeah, times have changed.
Yeah.
But
So did you write mostly nonfiction and poetry?
I tried fiction. It didn't work. I'm not good with that. A couple of people have asked me to write screenplays with them. I tell them I'm a writer of articles, but I'm willing to learn. So that's in the wings. Maybe we'll see. Knock wood. But I'm still writing articles. And the most recent article I did was about Marion C. Cooper, the creator of King Kong, the original. I never met Coop, but we had an intense relationship through correspondence from 1965 until his death in 1973. He introduced me to Ray Harryhausen through correspondence because Harryhausen's favorite film was King Kong. I don't think there's a week that went by from 1965 on that I didn't have in 1 week either a package, a letter, a telegram. I never got to meet Cooper, but he told me if I ever came west, he'd introduce me to Fay Ray. I met Fay finally. I told her that Cooper and I were friends, and she invited me to her apartment. And we spent 2 afternoons with Fay when she lived in Century City. I remember the first time I met Fay, we were in the lobby of her building, and I said I have an appointment to see Miss Ray. They told me that she's at a funeral. One of her best friends died, and I remember she walked into the lobby, and I felt guilty. I felt really bad. I said, "I'm so sorry. We can do this another time." And I'll never forget. She raised her hand and said, "No, life goes on." Another one of my favorite actors is Kirk Douglas. Kirk was appearing on the Gene London children's show here in Philadelphia, and I knew an editor at Channel 10, and I said, "Is there any way you can get me onto the set?" So he did, and I met Kirk. I've got a picture of he and I from 1974. We were chatting. I wanted him to know that I wasn't just a schmuck trying to meet him. And I knew he'd done Young Man with the Horn, directed by Michael Curtiz, who also did The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn. And so I said, "I love Young Man with the Horn. What was it like working with Michael Curtiz?" And he perked up and started talking to me about the film. His publicist was there and kept trying to get him to go to a radio interview, and he kept interrupting. And I remember Kirk saying, "Wait a minute, I'm talking to this gentleman." And I thought, that's class. That's old Hollywood. I was impressed. Douglas remains one of my favorite actors, and I felt blessed that I was able to talk to him and talk about Young Man with the Horn and his career. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it. It's
Was it
loosely
because you're
based.
able to, was it because you're able to talk about some of his lesser known works that you kind of like formed a connection with him?
Um, we never talked after that. That was a one-time only experience, but I felt that Hollywood was changing. He had directed and starred in Scalawag, which is a kiddie movie. It went nowhere. It was a bomb at the box office. So in a way, I felt maybe he responded because I was going back to the early days when his career began. And he's terrific in the film. It's loosely based upon the life of trumpeter Bix Beiderbecke. It's one of his best performances. Doris Day is in the film with him, along with Lauren Bacall. And there's another connection, Doris Day. I always loved Doris Day. She's still one of my favorite singers. I'd read that it was virtually impossible to reach her. She'd become very reclusive since she retired from recording and films. She's an animal activist, or was. I tracked her down to her animal foundation and wrote her a letter. And I got a package in the mail from the Animal Foundation. And I thought, oh, they're looking for a donation. I opened it up. It's talking about her work with animals, and wedged between one of the magazines with a color photograph of Doris. To Steve, thank you for your beautiful letter. Love, Doris Day. It was like, oh, I've even got letters from Bill Clinton. I wrote when we had 9/11 in 2001. Obviously, a horrible event in our country's history. Knowing that I was a poet, a number of friends said, have you considered writing a poem about what happened on that terrible day? And I thought, you're out of your mind. I don't have the words to talk about that. I mean, I'm hardly a great writer. I wouldn't know what to say. But they kept urging me, write something. So, all right, I thought I'll give it a try. I wrote a piece called For the Fallen. A lot of people seem to like it. I've performed it with orchestra and choir in some churches over the years. A sci-fi writer out on the West Coast named John DeCless recently wrote me and asked if he could get my permission to perform it himself out there. I said, of course. I knew Bill Clinton had an office in New York, and I thought, well, he was the president of the United States. I'll send it to him at his office. Not long after that, I got a letter in the mail from Bill Clinton's office in New York, and I almost threw it away. I thought it's looking for a donation of some kind. I opened it up, and it's on his presidential letterhead. It's personally signed by Bill Clinton. It says, "Dear Steve, loved your poem. The meaning and the passion involved in your writing it," and was like, oh my God, Bill Clinton liked my work. So I wrote another piece about soldiers. In fact, that was the title, Soldier. And I thought maybe lightning will strike twice. I sent that to him, and he wrote me a letter back again on his letterhead, signed in magic marker, Bill Clinton, the same signature with his letterhead. And I framed the first one. I had it professionally framed. And I thought, well, what the hell? I have the first one framed. It's just another letter from Bill. And then I thought, are you effing out of your mind? You've had two personal letters complimenting you on your writing from a former president of the United States. So they're both framed and hanging on my living room wall.
I like how you phrase it, just another letter from Bill.
Yeah. So I have to tell you, and if you watched my my 90-minute interview on February in February on Interfleet Broadcasting, which they seemed to like and other people liked. I always feel funny about talking about myself because I really am humble and have as much insecurity as anyone else. And I don't see myself as anything special. I've just been very, very lucky. And I get self-conscious when I talk about, this stuff. It sounds like, oh, and then I met, and then I met. And I try not to make it sound like I'm bragging. I'm really not. I've just been very fortunate, very lucky, and very blessed. And I'm not overly religious, but I regard myself as spiritual. I do believe in God. And if nothing else, God has been very good to me and very kind with blessing me with all of these relationships over the past half century or more.
Well, sounds like he has. Jumping back to Robert Bloch,
Yeah,
uh, did you uh, when did you first see Psycho?
I saw Psycho when it premiered in 1960. I remember I think it was the Viking Theater in Philadelphia. Everyone said it was horrifying and terrifying, and uh, you're going to be deeply affected by the climax. Don't tell anyone after you've seen the film. I kind of figured it out, and being a horror fan and uh, seeing horror movies throughout the 1950s, I hate to say it, but I guess I was, you should excuse the expression, psyched for it. It really didn't scare me. I loved it. I thought it was great filmmaking. I loved Hitchcock's direction. He's my favorite director. I know knew Pat Hitchcock. As I say, we sat together on a panel for an hour talking about her dad. Um, but it didn't really scare me. I thought it was brilliant filmmaking.
Now, when
Um,
you went to see Psycho, did it have all the stipulations like, you had to arrive right at time to
yeah,
see it, you couldn't be late?
yeah, you would not be allowed in the theater. That was true.
I know that you weren't supposed to give away the ending and everything and see what
Yeah.
happened.
I'll tell you another quick story, not related to Bob Bloch or horror. Um, One of my favorite actors is John Wayne. I didn't agree with his politics necessarily, but I love all of his films with John Ford. He was a part of The Searchers, I think the greatest Western ever made. And my friend Marion C. Cooper co produced it with John Ford. Anyway, long story short, 1963, Hatari is coming out to theaters. The night before, I'd been listening to a radio show, a local radio show, the Red Benson Show, and John Wayne, Red Buttons, and Bruce Cabot, the star of King Kong, were appearing on the show. I listened to the interview. They said we're going to be at the Stanton Theater tomorrow morning for the opening of Hatari in Philadelphia. So my brother and I, my best friend, wanted to go see John Wayne, Bruce Cabot, and Red Buttons at the Stanton Theater. I knew bloody well when we got to the theater, we'd be lucky to be standing in the very back, nowhere near them. So I said, you know what? We can see Hatari anytime. Let's walk around to the back of the theater. We did, and there was a row of Jeeps painted zebra paint on the Jeeps. I thought, aha, we struck gold. We're standing there. The door opens to the back of the theater. Out walks Bruce Cabot. I didn't have the presence of mind at that time to remember that he started in King Kong. But I held my autograph book out. He wrote B. Cabot. He didn't even write Bruce. Red Buttons came out, signed my book. All of a sudden, the door opens, and I looked up, 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 and this man mountain walks out the door, standing right next to me, John Wayne. I I couldn't think of anything to say. It was, they got in the Jeep and they drove away. But years later, I found out how I could contact John Wayne. I knew that his production company was called Batjack, and that was the name of the shipping company in wake of the Red Witch with John Wayne. Um, so I got the address for Batjack Productions. I wrote him a letter, and he was kind enough to write me back a letter, which I still have, along with an autograph still from True Grit, which he signed Rooster. And in the letter, he said, yeah, brought back a memory or two for me. And I treasure that letter and autograph still. My favorite TV series of all time, you're probably too young to remember this. It was called Route 66.
Heard of it.
It was on the CBS television network every Friday night, I think at 9 o'clock, starred George Maharis and Marty Milner. And it was all done on location. They traveled the country filming episodes of the series. They had great guest stars, people just beginning their careers. But Irwin and I were very shy, very introverted, and we became George Maharis and Marty Milner. We lived their episodes, their experiences vicariously every Friday night. Well, I heard that they were going to do 2 shows in Philadelphia. So they were staying at the Marriott Motor Hotel on City Avenue here in Philly. We cut school, took several buses to the Marriott, walked in the lobby. Again, I was a diehard film fanatic since I was 4 years old. I'd seen the FBI story with Jimmy Stewart. His co-star was Murray Hamilton. Murray Hamilton starred in an episode of The Twilight Zone playing Mr. Death with Ed Wynn. So my brother and I walk in the lobby. There's a man sitting across the hall on the couch reading a newspaper. I nudged my brother and I said, I think that's Murray Hamilton. So we walked over and I said, excuse me, are you Murray Hamilton? And I think he was shocked that this 15-year-old and 12-year-old knew who the hell he was. So he asked us to sit down and chatted with us for about a half an hour, talking about working with Jimmy Stewart and his other films. And he played a doctor in an episode of the series called The Thin White Line. Then Marty Milner came out of the elevator. George Maharis came out. We spoke with them both. And George was just amazing, just a nice, nice man. He said, we're shooting a scene down at the Ben Franklin Bridge in Center City, Philadelphia. Would you boys like to come down and watch us shoot? So we did. We took another couple of buses downtown to Philadelphia. They were shooting on Ben Franklin Bridge. We walked on the bridge one side. We saw them shooting the climactic scene on the other side. In the episode, Milner mistakenly takes an hallucinogenic and is going to commit suicide. And Maharis is trying to talk him off the bridge and say, don't do it, buddy, I love you. And we could actually hear him saying that. When they finished shooting the scene, we walked back down and Maharis saw us and was smiling and shook our hands and said, thanks for coming. When we were shooting part of the documentary about my life and career, we recreated that. The camera crew and sound folks traveled down to the Ben Franklin Bridge, and I stood right where they had stood so many years earlier. And I maintained something of a relationship with George until he died. He would telephone me from time to time. I always sent him a birthday card. I've got letters from him. And I have recorded telephone calls from him where he's mispronouncing my name, thanking me for the birthday greetings and saying, Steve, Vertlieb. I just wanted to thank you. And I got a couple of those, and he was very cute, but I was sad when he died. A part of my childhood died with him, I think. Anyway, I hate to keep boring you with these stories, but
Anyway, with I guess we'll jump to H.P. Lovecraft. What was the first Lovecraft story you read?
maybe Pickman's Model. I read everything he ever wrote. I read his short stories and novellas. My favorite is The Shadow Out of Time. That literally scared the hell out of me. I thought it was the scariest novel I'd ever read. I started researching Lovecraft, reading about his history, his childhood, that he was very, very conservative and prim and proper, never married, lived a very, very secluded life, just immersed in his writing.
So he was married for a brief little bit, but it wasn't very
Really?
long.
Okay. Bob Bloch was exactly the opposite of Lovecraft. Bob was free and very outgoing and out there in your face and funny and giving lectures at conventions. Um, my friend George Stover and George, as I said, appears in many of John Waters' films. In Female Trouble, he's the priest walking divine to the electric chair. Uh, but I've known George forever. He's a dear friend. George and this would have been, I think, around 1981. I was some group, the Maryland Association of Fan Clubs, gave me Best Writer of the Year, invited me down to their dinner and gave me this trophy. Um, George and I went down there to accept it, and the guest of honor was Stephen King. And as luck would have it, our table was right next to Stephen King's table.
Mm.
So George said, "What do you think? Should we?" I said, "Yeah, what the hell? All he can tell us is get out of my face." So we gave him a copy of our magazine, Cinemacabre, with my articles in there, shook his hand. He was quite a gentleman, very nice. Um, I remember, I remember, I thought he's so down to earth that um, before he was introduced, the kitchen ran out of alcohol, and he liked his alcohol. He put on his leather jacket, got on his bike, rode to a local uh, tavern, picked up a case of beer, brought it back to the table, all before he was introduced to accept his award. Um, but it was very funny. That's the only contact I ever had with Stephen King, but he sat right next to us, watched me get my award. I watched him get his. I thought he's just a normal guy who wants to have some beers.
Yeah.
Uh,
Like a good
and
American.
yeah, dear American.
Yeah.
I'm running out of stories, guys.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think I'm starting to lose my voice.
Yeah. When I guess when Robert Bloch always seemed like he was very genuinely interested in fandom. He like
He
wrote several
was.
articles about fandom
Yeah,
and
he was. He was very much into fandom. He appreciated his fans and was very gracious and very generous with them. He was very personable. Never saw a fan he didn't like. Um, but he and I just hit it off beyond the fan level. As I say, he became a mentor to me in my writing, as Lovecraft perhaps was to him. He knew everyone I knew, Bradbury, Harryhausen. Um, I just adored him. I regarded him as one of my best friends. I was heartbroken when he died. I knew Ellie. Um, it's kind of strange what happened to Ellie. I called her the day that Bob died. and we spoke for a while. And she said to me that she's going to move back to her home in Canada, that now that Bob was gone, she felt no connection to Hollywood or California. And she did. She moved back and became very reclusive, just involved with her family, and that was the end. Um, but it was the passing of an era.
Now,
Um,
now Bloch also did paintings as well. Did you ever see him doing
yeah,
any painting?
I
No.
didn't see him, but I saw some of his work when I was out at the house. Um, Ellie made dinner for us. She even, I, I remember after dinner, she made us a care package because Urban had a small apartment in LA, and we basically went to burger joints. Neither of us had much money. And so Ellie put together a care package from her refrigerator and said, here, take this home. This should be enough food for you both for a week. Uh, but I have very loving memories, the two of them. If you've seen my articles, I wrote one called Robert Bloch, the Clown at Midnight, which was about our personal friendship and had a number of photographs of Bob and Ellie and I. The other I did more recently for a book about Bloch that was published in Australia. I'm sure you're aware of it. Can't think of the title. The Man Who Created Psychos or something like that. But
I
it
got
was
that written
published.
somewhere. Um,
Yeah,
The Clown at Midnight and the Psychology of Horror.
yeah, those were my two articles. And the psychology of horror appeared in a book that was published in Australia with a book of essays about him. Um, I'm not sure if the book did very well. I have copies of it here, but this was years ago, so I never got paid for the book. And in fact, I had to buy a copy. So I thought, hey, it's my work. I own the rights to it. So I republished it with File 770. That's run by Mike Glyer. It's a major West Coast Fanish publication. He's won several Hugos for File 770. Mike and I became good buddies. And for the last half dozen years or so, he's been my major publisher. Um, I even did my massive Sinatra uh, career retrospective with Mike. Um, the guy I originally wrote it for, his platform went down and all of that work disappeared. And I don't think he was terribly interested in rebuilding it. So again, I thought this is my work. It's the longest article I've ever written in my life. It's called Sinatra All the Way. And I thought Mike Lyer, File 770, science fiction, fantasy horror, Hugo Awards. Nah, they're not going to want to print this. I said, I don't suppose there's any chance in hell that you'd be interested in doing this. He said, yeah, absolutely. My readers would be interested. So I spent an entire day researching rare foreign posters and looking up production stills and put it all together. And first, what would have been Sinatra's birthday, December the 12th of last year, File 770 published my article about Sinatra. And I'm very, very proud of that. And it's back in print, and I'm just delighted. So, in any event, I'm running out of breath. So maybe I should.
We'll wrap up just a little bit.
Yeah,
Uh,
go ahead.
Robert Bloch has he's known as like a master of horror, but at the same time, he was known for his humor and his puns and stuff like that. Is there like a contradiction to you? Did you have a hard time meshing the two, or they seem quite normal?
um, I do and I don't. I regard myself as a serious film historian, and when I'm writing, I'm committed to writing serious work. Hopefully, it's received that way. I won the Hugos, so not the Hugo. I won the Rondo Hall of Fame Life Achievement Awards. So, but when I'm around my friends, I'm always cracking stupid jokes and tend to be very cornball and sentimental. And so I guess you have to balance that out to remain sane. I know I do. When I'm writing, I'm serious. When I'm with my friends, I'm always cracking puns and bad jokes. And I guess Bob, to keep his sanity and his that fine line between your real life and what you're creating on paper. And certainly his wife, Ellie, did not want to see that side of him. And when we had dinner at his dinner table in the Hollywood Hills at his home, most of the conversation was bad jokes. And he kept my brother and I laughing hysterically for a couple of hours. So I don't know. I guess I kind of get it.
That's not how I normally picture being an evening with like, Robert Bloch and
Well, it was a whole day from his being our tour guide, my first trip to California, showing us the sights, going to Paramount and visiting George Powell, going to Fari Ackerman's house and seeing the collection, and then winding up with Bob and Ellie for an evening, and then driving us back home. Um, Again, I have to pinch myself when I think of the experiences I've had and the people I've known in our interaction, and it's been an inspiration to me. It continues to inspire me today.
yeah, sounds like it. I was curious, do you have like any of your poems handy? That you...
I not handy, but if you're interested, if you want to give me your email
Okay.
address, I can send you my poem about 9/11, which includes the letter from President Clinton. And I can dig up some of the horror
Yeah,
poems.
I'd like to see some of especially the horror
Yeah,
ones
I
that
can.
maybe that Robert
Yeah,
Bloch may have like, like say read.
yeah. Um, I'll tell you what, off air, I can give you my email, or if you want to, when we finish on messaging on Facebook,
Mhm.
if you want to give me your email, and I'll dig up some of my horror fantasy poems and send them to you.
All righty, well, we done. It sounds good. I want to thank you for being on the show and everything.
Well, it's my honor, guys. I hope I hope I haven't bored you. I hope it's been interesting.
It's been very
Um,
interesting. And so you've
well,
lived quite a very interesting life.
well,
I can't say you've been boring.
in conclusion, I would just say have a wonderful summer. Let's please keep in touch, and God bless.
All right, well, take care.
You
And
take care too.
before we go, I want to talk about, you used to do like an episode, a word for the episode, and the one I wanted to pick for was psycho, since that's like, or Bloch's supposed to say, which was supposed to be short for psychotic. One of the earliest known uses for psycho appeared in 1910s, was an early evidence, was also in the Chicago Tribune in 1914. And but it gained notoriety in 1960 release of the movie by Alfred Hitchcock. And so, Psycho, the movie, helped popularize, that term.
Well, and again, to everyone watching or listening to this show, Alfred Hitchcock said right up until his death that 90% of his film was Robert Bloch.
It is amazing how accurate, faithful, I can say, that the movie is to the book.
Mm-hmm.
There were like a very few changes to it.
I did get to meet Janet Leigh and spend a little bit of time with her. She was a lovely lady, and happily she was still alive. And I don't know if I mentioned this when we started an hour and a half ago. No, almost 2 hours ago. My God, that Bob did say that because people were terrified when Psycho came out, they were afraid of getting into the shower.
My mother was that way.
Yeah. Bob famously said it's a good thing I didn't have her killed on the toilet. No, no one would ever have taken a shit again. But sorry, I apologize for the vulgarity.
Anyway,
Anyway,
thank you.
listen, take care. God bless. And please send me your email on messaging and I'll send some stuff to you.
I will do.
So, all right, guys, be well. Thank you.
Thank you.
The stars are no longer right. We must cease all discussions until they line again next month. 30 plus minutes of H.P. Lovecraft is sponsored by the newly remodeled Bates Motel. You'll die over the new showers. This podcast is created in association with LovecraftPod.com and Logan Speculative Fiction Group, with help from the Logan County Public Library and the Great Old Ones. Special thanks to Katie Tysons for being the Norman Bates of podcast editing, and Bobby Deary for the ultimate ultimatum, and Josh for the Pasta Gate #1. Until we meet again, may you avoid Princess Cthulhu and her new playmate, Red Jack.